Welcome to As Built, the podcast about architecture firms and buildings and how both get built. I'm your host, Brian Jones. My guest today is architect and principal at Clayton Korte, Paul Clayton. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. We're going to dive into your career a little bit and to the history of the firm. Before we talk specifically about Clayton Korte, I wanted to take a moment and kind of go back in time a little bit when you were first starting out building up the practice, and specifically with your purchase of Emily Little Architects. So how did that come about? How did that process begin? Because you've been working for the firm for a bit.
Sure. Yeah. I started my career in Austin in 99 and worked for a guy doing big houses on the lake. And they were massive, even by today's standards. The last house that I worked on when I was there was 85 yards long and 18,000 square feet. Just a behemoth. The guy at the time, I was 24 years old. I had just finished grad school. And at the time, the guy was a couple of years older than me. And he had started a tech firm and he was doing very well. But it was just him and his wife. And they didn't have kids yet. To be fair, they had one on the way. But that really struck a chord in me. And I knew at that point that I needed to get out and find work doing projects for a more normal section of society. I searched actually for quite some time. I came up with Emily's firm as well as a couple of others, but I was really focused on the work that Emily was doing and focused on the relationship she had with people in the community and her reputation. I think I sent my resume to her. We joke. I think I sent it to her 4 times. And finally one day got at the gumption to take my resume to her office, and I handed it to her bookkeeper. And I said, I'd really like to say hi to Emily. Never met. And I'm obviously interested in a position here. They had responded to me and told me they didn't have anything open. But I said, just for future sake, I'd like to say hi. She took the meeting. I rolled out this ridiculous set of drawings for this house I was working on. It's the only thing I had to show. And she thought it was funny, and she was amazed by the just scale of it because it was nothing like what she was doing at the time. And I got a job. I was thrilled. I started working for her in 2000. Very quickly came to understand why she was so revered in the community. She's just a really incredible person, and I was lucky to have her as a mentor early in my career. So to your question, leading up to the purchase of her firm, I've always had something inside me, an entrepreneurial bent that I just can't shake. It became pretty clear to me that I was probably a better owner than I would be employee, and at least in the long term. And I started exploring that and decided to make the jump in 2003. I was still working for Emily, at least part-time, and we had very open conversations about it. She was wonderful with supporting me and what I felt like I needed to do. And finally, after having kind of one foot in the door and one foot out, about 2005, we began, or I guess about a year before that, we started talking about Emily's future and her transition plans, which is something that she hadn't considered and was very exciting to us both. I think I kind of stumbled into this idea of acquiring a firm versus building something from nothing with my own relationships. So in a lot of ways, I feel like we both got very lucky in exploring that when we did. Emily has remained active within the firm. Only until recently has she really began to scale back her time in the office. It's been a really mutually beneficial relationship.
So thinking a little bit about that, after the acquisition began or you acquired the firm, maintaining those relationships, and how did you begin to introduce any changes, or did changes occur in the firm right away, or did those happen sort of over time, and how did you implement those?
That's a good question. Emily very much remained in a leadership position, and I had, at that point in my career, I had a lot of growing to do. I had to essentially grow into my own boots. And like I said, I was very happy to have her there as a mentor to do that. I didn't take the reins and try to institute or impress my own overlay onto things. I really and truly let the organization develop over time. I have, like I said, something with a motor inside me that sometimes I can't help. And I always knew that I would do projects other than smaller remodels. And so we began to take work that was larger whenever it came in, and I was able to satisfy those urges and also build upon the firm's portfolio. And one project leads to the next. And I think that Emily and I both, in that capacity, were growing.
When it became time to think about renaming the firm, how did that conversation and come about? And then what was the process of doing that to bring everybody along?
The process of Emily leaving the firm.
Yeah. Well, in terms of like converting to Clayton Cody and
Yeah, so the Clayton Korte name change came along in
Cody.
2017. Brian Korte began working with us in 2015 when we opened our office in San Antonio. And Brian comes with a good amount of experience and a portfolio of his own. He's a very talented person. And over time, he's built his clientele to the point that it became large enough percentage of the firm's revenue that they deserve to be recognized for that. And the change in he was made a partner. That's another important fact of the name change. But even as partner, we were Clayton and Little for a while, and it got to the point where we felt like we needed to give him the deserved recognition of a change of the masthead. So we changed the name of the firm, changed the brand a bit, website, just kind of brushed off our image.
Design is pretty clearly a central part of the practice. And as you've grown, the the design has remained true. And how have you managed to grow that as the firm has grown as well?
Yeah, that's the hardest question to answer. It has to do with hiring the right people, surrounding ourselves with very talented and capable designers. They they have their own motor internally, and I've tried to give people plenty of space to do what they're really good at. And there's a point at which they are able to do it on their own, but very often early in a person's career, they just need some direction and knowing when that's enough for that particular part of the building or even that phase versus, hey, you haven't really gone far enough. You haven't studied this to the point that it truly deserves. And that seems to be the role that I've kind of fallen into. So it's
More guiding and yeah.
yeah, exactly. Just giving the guidance that a very talented staff needs to meet our goals.
Kind of speaking of goals, the firm services now include interior design and experience design, which is not something you see that often in an architecture firm. But was that something that happened over time in response to a client specific client demand, or did the firm proactively see work in those areas?
Yeah, no, it's for sure. Definitely came from a project type. We have done a lot of hospitality work. One of the early projects that Emily and I took in '06 was the St. Cecilia Hotel here in Austin. And it was pivotal in a lot of ways. It opened the door to a lot more hospitality projects. And that typology is very much about the experience that is created. And it's a mixture architecture, interiors, and brand. The most successful projects we've been involved in are those which create a real harmony in those three things. So we began doing them internally, both as a means to an end, but also to increase the level of quality of our work. We feel like if we can control some of those things in certain instances, we can create a better outcome.
I'd imagine too that once you have an example of that to showcase to a client, it becomes easier for them to understand what that process yields at the end of that.
It's a lot of fun for clients in that project typology.
Has there been anything unexpected that's happened that's due to the firm's growth and the new project services, things that you didn't necessarily anticipate along the way?
Yeah, that question is easy to answer. The pandemic was a thing that I haven't anticipated. It is really and truly, I think, forever changed our industry. There's been a change in young designers' attitude towards career and having boundaries around work, and also I would say workplace values. It's this is a industry in which building a career can be difficult. It requires full days. It requires putting in the time. And in a lot of ways, you have to earn your stripes. And it's directly at odds with what's happened in the world over the past 3 years. And our firm, as well as most other firms I've spoken to, are struggling with the same thing. And it's the toothpaste is out of the tube, figuring out the new challenge of how to produce really excellent work in this climate is an unforeseen challenge.
Well, and other professionals I've spoken to as well, mentorship comes to the top of the mind of having to really evolve in how you approach the mentorship and how you engage with people, especially given the variety of office configurations that exist. Has that been true for you as well?
Oh, absolutely. We've brought in experts. We've spent a lot of time internally developing programs and training content of our own. Structurally, we've changed the organization to accommodate. It's just a little different engagement, I think, with staff. And once once you kind of understand that what they need in that engagement, I think it's a little easier to solve.
Kind of broadly speaking, on the heels of that, you've got kind of the growth in one bucket, you've got sort of the challenges of the market relative to talent and everyone kind of in another. So how do you continue to build on the quality of design? How do you communicate that internally? Because externally you have your projects that you showcase to your clients, but internally, how do you go about cultivating?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. The one of the consultants that we use taught me about concept span of control and this idea that in from the beginning of time in military units, there's only a certain number of grunts that a sergeant can have under his direct control and retain control. And different industries have different spans of control. And what I've learned in our growth is that that span of control is really tested because those who have 5 to 10 people working beneath them have really got to be pulling in the same direction as you are for the firm. And if it's off any even fractions of a degree, we can end up in different places. Brian Cordy and I, my partner in San Antonio, have talked hours about this, and it's something that just really deserves a lot of thought and cultivation within our own staff and leadership to really make sure that we're not only pulling the same direction, but the expectations are also in alignment.
It's a tall order for
It
sure.
is, yes.
Well, I really want to thank you for taking the time. This has been really, really a great conversation, and I appreciate that.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Brian.
This has been As Built.